Excellent. Well, thank you, Laura, so much for joining me today to discuss this very interesting topic of the intersection between child sponsorship programs and the transition of residential care services. So, before we get into the meat of this topic, would you mind giving us just a little bit of background on you, your organization, and how you came to be involved in providing residential care in Sierra Leone?
Sure. My name is Dr. Laura Horvath, and I am the Director of Programs and Global Engagement at Helping Children Worldwide. Helping Children Worldwide is a 501c3 organization that supports a program in Sierra Leone, in a city there called Bo, that started in 2000 as a residential children's home or orphanage, that was then called the Child Rescue Center. The goal of that center was to rescue children who had been orphaned and separated from their families because of an 11-year civil war that had raged on there. Um, it actually began conceptually as a street feeding program and an exceptionally generous church collection led them instead to creating a home for 40 children that were living on the street and didn't know where their families were. And it operated as a children's home for 16 years before we began the process to transition from that residential model to family care. The Child Rescue Center turned into the Child Reintegration Center officially, I think, in 2018 or 2019, and now reintegrates street connected children and children otherwise separated from family back into family. It has a family strengthening program that tries to move families to independence and self reliance. And it has a very small transition support services department that tries to help orphanages in the West African and other areas transition their model of care in a similar way.
Brilliant. That's amazing. That's excellent, excellent work and a really interesting transition. And thankfully, we already have some of that case study
Yeah.
documented. So for those who want to learn more about the actual transition process, you can access those resources in the Transition Hub on the Better Care Network website. But at the same time as you had this residential service prior to the transition, you also had a child sponsorship fundraising model operating, from what I understand, in the US. Can you tell us a little bit about how that child sponsorship model worked and also about how the donors were engaging with the children
Through that model.
through the
Sure.
model?
Yeah, pretty quickly from the inception of the orphanage, not exactly sure how quickly, but pretty quickly on, we incorporated what we called the Sponsor a Child program or the SAC program. So I might refer to it as SAC because I'm from the Washington, D.C. area and we talk in letters. So pretty early on, that came on board. It was created by a former staff member. It was very closely modeled on sponsored child programs that people are probably more familiar with from sort of much larger that continue to operate child sponsorship models. Um, it it was, I think, roughly $25 a month or whatever that translates to per year. Sorry, my background is English, not math. Um, you could do it either way in terms of funding. Those funds went into the FEA, or I'm sorry, the SAC program pool, and from that pool, a lot of the O&M kind of stuff was funded at the orphanage. But it was meant to cover the kids' medical needs, access to education, feeding and all the things that go into the care of children in a residential setting. Um, Donors interacted with the children they sponsored. So they were paired up, donor to child, and they sent probably, I think at one point it was maybe 4 letters a year back and forth and photographs. I'll tell you very honestly that those letters on the Sierra Leonean side, that was an event where all the kids would be brought together and a letter template would be put on a blackboard. And the letters typically, I'm in class 5. My favorite food is rice. My favorite color is, whatever. Thank you for your letter and so pretty formulaic kind of, responses back, which I think is pretty typical, especially in a country where even though the spoken language, the official spoken language is English, the children were coming to us speaking Mende and Temne and Creole and not, you know, terribly literate in English in the beginning anyway. So yeah, that's probably.
Yeah, great. How it was all working. And when you transitioned, I think from memory it was after you transitioned or were maybe perhaps in the tail end of it even, you also made the decision to touch that child sponsorship model and make a pretty radical change to the way that was operating. So can you talk us through why? What did you start to observe or perceive, or what were you sort of feeling that led you to make a decision to move away from that? And then we'll get you to talk us through how that kind of step that out, how that went down internally, externally, all those kinds of dynamics. But we'll start with the why. What did you notice that led you to start to reconsider that model?
Right. So I'm in primarily the program side of HCW's work. And so where I'm really focused on is what's happening on the ground, how families are impacted and what are the services provided to them and what are the outcomes of all of that. That's really where I'm focused on. I mean, in a nonprofit, everybody's job is development, but my headspace is in programs. And so for a long time, child sponsorship, the child sponsorship piece for me was just, it was kind of just how we funded the things we were trying to do. But what I realized, pretty pretty close to the end of transition, was that we had gone from 16 years of being very focused on the specific needs of individual children, or just children, and now we're placing them into families, and these families weren't, you know, wealthy. There was a reason why they were separated. There was a reason why that child was in institutional care, and those reasons still existed even once we put them back. And so we had to change the program. When I say we, I mean the programs on the ground, and I should not say we because I don't do that. But the program side was beginning to realize that you can't just put a child back into a family and continue to focus on the needs of the child within this vulnerable family, that they needed to shift their social work and their case management to include the entire family. And one of the examples that someone used was, if you think of a baby mobile, and they're like 4 little toys on a baby mobile, if you hit one of them, or you cut the string of one of them, it's going to cause chaos in all the other pieces. If you cut the string, it's going to cause an imbalance. And so actually one of the social workers on the ground there told me that. And so they just started thinking about the family as a unit. But over here, we still have a donor that's very focused on this child in isolation. And they're getting, you know, photos once or twice or 3 times a year, or whatever, of the child as the child is growing, but it's just the child, and they're getting a letter from just the child. And it's creating this false perception that this child is not surrounded by people who love it and care for it and feed it and, you know, take it to school and, you know, all the things that families do for their kids. And that felt almost dishonest, or it's certainly dishonoring of the families that were being served. And so that was one big discomfort that I had. The other thing that happened was the shift of the program on the ground was, we want to get children into families as quickly as we safely can, you know, and in the best possible ways, all the best practice and all that. And we want those families to be strengthened and empowered so that they don't stay on our roster forever. And we want that to happen as quickly as it possibly and safely can. And the problem from the fundraising side, what I realized finally is, you've got programs now working against development, because one of the beauties of a child sponsorship program is it's guaranteed funding that you can count on. And in a nonprofit where we're all, you know, grabbing for grants, we're all having these events and fundraisers and trying to raise as much money as we possibly can, what you don't have a lot of is the knowledge that I'm going to have at least this amount of money coming in each month, or every year. And a sponsorship program, a child sponsorship program, in order for it to sort of work really well on the development side, you want to get a donor on the hook and keep them on the hook for a long time. So now I've got this dilemma where I've got program people on the ground who are trying to move families off of support as fast as possible, and they're going to break that connection with a donor that the development side of the house wants to hold on to for as long as they possibly can. So I think once we realized that once you peel back the layers of what child sponsorship is, it's just a dedicated donor program. And so to find another way to get donors dedicated to what you're doing that isn't going to put pressure on program people to keep people in dependency forever so that we can keep that money coming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you're saying, it is a fundraising mechanism that tries to create long-term, sustainable, dependable funding streams. But as you're also indicating, it does shape programs. It shapes donor perceptions, and it actually does shape programs. So it's not neutral, from my own experience of it, but also from what I'm hearing in what you're saying of your experience. And that's the tension, isn't it? Because if it was
Yeah.
neutral, maybe we could say, okay, let it go on. But because it does shape a donor's perception of what's happening, which then can create some mismatched expectations over time that can start to have an impact on that funding stream. But also, as you were saying, it can create tensions within the program team where they're not necessarily fully free to really program towards the best outcomes of those who are accessing their services. And at this point, that's a family, no longer just an individual child. So yes, it's a mechanism, but not one without other implications. And so
Yeah.
when you transitioned, did you see any of that? You're talking right now about how you saw that manifest post-transition once children were back and some of
Yeah.
the implications of keeping that program at that point in time and the mismatch. Did you also see any kind of issues arising whilst you were transitioning, primarily because of the potential mismatch between the donor's perception of the child versus the full reality of the child having a family that they could return to?
Yeah. I wish I could say yes. We weren't that quick on the uptake. And at first we thought, well, okay, we want to shift the donor understanding from child to family. So we get that pretty quickly. And so we thought, well, we'll make it a family sponsorship, essentially. We'll just, we'll now send pictures of children with their families. We'll have letters that explain who these people are and their roles in the family. And we'll do updates that include family news and things like that. We'll hold letter events where the family comes and engages in that, or the case manager goes to the house and solicits a letter that way. Usually it's the children who are still writing those letters because most of the caregivers are not literate. But I think we thought that would just take care of it. We're just going to, sort of shift the donor perception and that would take care of it. We didn't realize right away that it was actually driving programs in a negative way. And I think once we realized that, and that was maybe a year out of the transition, and we were just at cross purposes. And I raised this idea of shifting to this what we now call family empowerment advocacy model, and doing a whole re-education of our donors about why we were changing this and all of that. It has taken us 5 years to really fully transition that model. We are still educating donors on a daily basis. The new advocates that have added on don't have to do a whole lot of education of that. It's a new program or whatever. They kind of come in new and fresh and without these preconceived ideas. But we still are educating our donors that transition from sponsorship to advocacy about what all that means and why we did it. And there's still a lot of resistance in some pockets through that process. We actually lost, I believe we've lost HCW staff over this that were so in love with the SAC program that they helped to set up, that couldn't make this shift. I mean, it's very similar to like you lose donors when you do an orphanage transition. But I just felt really strongly, and then others on staff kind of joined me in this belief that it really is not just not neutral, it's negative. It was driving programs in, I believe, harmful ways. So I really believe that if you're going to transition your orphanage model, you have to transition your short-term mission, and you have to transition your child sponsorship model as a part of it if you're going to really do it like the whole way.
Yeah, because they're so interlinked, aren't they? Both of those mechanisms create a donor child experience that isn't going to be commensurate with what happens when that transition has been outworked. So that's absolutely true and really insightful. So talk us through, you've sort of started to talk a little bit about how some donors may or may not have gravitated to that, and the long-term education aspect to it. But you've also stated
Yeah.
that some staff had issues to the point where they were willing to leave their jobs and willing to leave the organization. So talk us through how you stepped this out with your staff. How did you start to approach the conversation internally to I guess put words to what you were sensing was this mismatch between the funding mechanism and the impact it was having on programs. How did you address the opposition, and maybe give us a little bit more detail on what that opposition was, but how did you actually step that out to the point where you made the change and then implemented that change?
Yeah. Well, I think so. Certainly I was developing some discomfort from a program perspective. And a lot of what I do is sort of help build capacity of programs on the ground and support the work that they're trying to do or whatever, but also message that back to the development side. So we're like, here's what's happening. So now I'm talking out of one side of my mouth about how we're strengthening families and moving them toward independence, but at the same time, there's this mechanism I feel like is trying to hold on to them. And so, lots of internal conversations between program and development to talk about, okay, well, really the realities of that's all well and good, but this is like, I can't remember what percentage of our funding is sourced by this. Like, you can't just turn the tap off completely on something without having to, something to move to. And even from a program perspective, like I love knowing that I've got money coming in. That enables us to plan. You know, that's that's us being able to operate on the program side with intention and a planning for the future or whatever, instead of just this, oh my gosh, we have a grant, we better do something right now. So I didn't come to this lightly. This wasn't like a clear um the program side coming to the development side and saying, well, we're just going to change this because, it's just this clear black and white thing. There's a lot of conversations around, okay, well, how much of this dedicated donor thing can we tease out and keep? And how much of this program piece do we have to kind of put on the other side? And how are we going to reframe this? And how are we going to convince advocates that they'll be okay to kind of advocate for a family for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is, and then will they actually advocate then for another family? I mean, a lot of this, we just took big leaps of faith and big risks, and we didn't know how it would all turn out. And I'm an academic. I come from my previous role was in teaching at the university, and so my instinct is to go immediately to research. So I went to Better Care Network. I went to Faith to Action. I went to now I can't think who Bethany. Bethany had done a transition of their child sponsorship model. Project Red had done, and there were all these different ways that people were approaching it. And we just collected sort of ideas. Well, what if we did it this way? Well, what if we did it this way? And I think Bethany's was it put much greater distance between the sponsor or the donor and the family or that they were connected to. And I was in favor of that. And folks on this team really wanted that personal connection to remain. And I didn't win that particular battle. we're still, in a mode of being very connected, the donor and the family being connected. Since then, we've talked with Ikisa has a way that they do it, that has some aspects that I really love. Safe International has a way that they do it, and we just poached ideas from each other. I mean, we did the thing that Better Care Network is designed to do. We got into collaborative spaces and we said, hey, we know that this isn't right, and we want to do it better, and we just need to learn from each other.
That's amazing. I mean, that's what this is, isn't it? When you're innovating, it's
Yeah,
about taking what you can, drawing as much from the evidence and learning that's out there, and then really,
yeah,
I guess, leveraging that to innovate beyond what's already in existence. So it sounds like you approach it exactly the same way I would: gather what you can
yeah,
and then innovate with what you don't know. But tell us about what happened to your funding stream. So if you were to sort of plot it on a graph, can you sort of talk us through what happened in terms
yeah.
of dips and, potentially new donors coming on? I don't know whether you've done any analysis of your financial data, sort of tracking how it went over time, but if you have, perhaps talk us through that.
Yeah. No, and you know what? I really should get with the development side, and we should actually do that like for real on paper. I can tell you anecdotally, because this is just how HCW is, I think. When we decided to finally pull the trigger, and announce it to our former sponsors and explain what it was, a big education campaign. We had letters that went out and email. We did a lot of social media around it, explaining what we were doing, why we were doing it, that it was to support the way that programs were actually being run in Sierra Leone. It was to try to create more honor and dignity around the caregivers and the family, and lift them up and recognize their role in ways that we hadn't before. All of those things. We also decided to just take a really big risk and say, we're changing this whole thing, and also um, we would like to encourage you to donate more than you were, to commit to a higher monthly giving amount or yearly giving amount than you did before. And initially, we had a spike. There was some excitement around it, and the funding went up a little bit. I think for the first maybe year and a half, we saw it jump up. Since then, we have seen it fall off. I think we're still in a space where it's not back up to the level that we would like it to be, or it was before. Um, I don't know if that has to do with what sort of the current environment as well. But I will also own the fact that I think people who thought they understood it initially have continued to struggle, I think, to really get their head wrapped around it, because I think there's a natural inclination. It's sort of like when you say the word orphanage to people, people go, oh, I know what that is. When you talk about a family strengthening program, that's a little mushier in people's heads. I think the same thing happens with child sponsorship. If you say child sponsorship, people think, oh, compassion, world vision. I know what that is. You write a check and the kid sends a letter and you put a picture on your fridge, and that's very understandable. What we're doing now is different, and it takes a whole lot more explanation and education and re-education and messaging and messaging and messaging. And it's not like you can just educate people at once and then they get it. You have to continue to message that over and over and over again and reiterate to people so that they can, really understand what you're trying to do. And it's more complex, I think.
It absolutely is more complex. And I think we'd be, we'd be in some ways potentially fooling ourselves to also not acknowledge that part of the lure of a child sponsorship model is that when families who are sponsors are facing their own, financial struggles, when things are getting tight economically, as you're saying, maybe a potential impact presently, they start to reprioritize. The idea of releasing a child from a sponsorship model feels like you'd have to be much closer to the edge financially yourself to make that cut than it does a family, because there's just this inherent sense of vulnerability around a child, and particularly one that's been messaged as quite alone. So I think there is a
Yes.
dynamic there that is very ingrained. And that's the aspect of child sponsorship that kind of aligns itself or pivots off this quasi-parent child perception in order to,
Yeah.
really keep these sponsors on board long term. That's hard to replace with a family model. Even if they understand it,
Yeah.
that sense isn't there because it's just very, very different. So,
Right.
but I think, as you're saying, we have to grapple with that. We have to say, and even if that's the case, we are still going to do this because ultimately we're undermining ourselves if we don't. We have to diversify
Yeah.
those funding models in response to be doing the best thing and the right thing by these families and their children. I think also,
Yeah.
as you said, people go, oh, I know that because orphanages, because child sponsorship has been spoken about in these circles for decades, perhaps even longer. I'm not enough of a historian to know when these things started, but they've been reinforced in churches, on platforms, at conferences, over
Yeah.
and over and over and over and over, to the point where it's like seeing a Coca-Cola brand. You go, I know what that is. I don't need any explanation. We're now having to rebuild that. We're having to do that work, lay that groundwork for family preservation, family strengthening. Perhaps one day we'll all get to see the results of that, and the next
I hope I
generation.
live. I hope I live to see that. I hope I live to see that day. Well, and I think even beyond educating about what family advocacy is, for us, it's family empowerment advocacy, but like what this is, um, even beyond that, there's a whole like re-education of child sponsorship and the flaw or the flaws in a child sponsorship model. So we've done some very candid kind of conversations with our donors about how child sponsorship models insert a donor often between the child and the caregiver. We've had sponsors, former sponsors, who have rung us up and said, essentially, I'm donating 300 and however much a year, and the child I sponsor wants to attend this school instead of this school. And I have to say, that's not your decision. Because you pay doesn't mean you get to have a say in that. That child has a mother, and that mother will choose where she goes to school, even if the girl doesn't want to go there. Like that's that's the equivalent of me telling you where your child should go to school. Like that's not a thing. And so re-educating people and trying to help them to understand that, like, there is harm that happens in a child sponsorship model. For example, we had a child sponsorship model where um, only two children in a family, a maximum of two children in a family, could be sponsored. So then you have a situation where some kids and families in the family have sponsors and some don't. How does that make the non-sponsored child feel? Or even on a community level, this family in the community has sponsors and these don't. How does that make those members of the community feel? And then Hunter Farrell's book, Freeing Congregational Mission, he talks about, I think he shares this anecdote of having a woman say to him, a stranger writes my 11-year-old daughter. Like, how weird is that? And is that something that you would allow? And so helping our donors to understand the unintended harm that just is sort of baked into the child sponsorship model that we're trying to get away from. We're trying to migrate. So right now, our model is connecting donors with families, and the families write letters. And it's a little bit better. What I would love for us to migrate to is a model where the donor is communicating with the case manager that's supporting a number of families. And then the case manager is maybe reporting success stories, sort of that they're picking out of their caseload. Here's the impact that your financial commitment, here's the real, the real life kind of story. So you're still getting the real story of real people and their lives being changed and made better, but it's not so connected to a
Yeah,
vulnerable family in
yeah.
the ground. Yeah.
That's in my previous role with ACC International. That's pretty much what we did. We moved from child sponsorship to what we called Village Life, which was people funding that program on that kind of level, but it went into a pool of funds that then provided support to the community programs of community development and family strengthening programs that multiple families and children accessed. And then they would get a story from within a pool of stories. It wouldn't be connected to a given child or a specific family, but every quarter they'd get a story, an update from one family's
Yeah.
perspective about how the programs were empowering them and enabling them. And yeah, it was difficult because it wasn't what people were used to. It wasn't
Yeah. Yeah.
my child direct connection kind of thing that
Yeah.
people are used to. So I won't pretend that it was easy or that it had no consequences for the
No,
funding.
it's much better.
It definitely
Yeah.
did, but that was the direction that we decided to take with it. So with all these realities, if we were to
Yeah.
draw, we've kind of discussed together, you've got a model that isn't neutral, as we discussed at the beginning. And so because it has implications for programs, because it perpetuates ideas that aren't long-term helpful for the child, the family, but also just in terms of that donor education piece, that understanding development, understanding what these issues really are that other countries are facing, communities are facing. It's not helpful. And so you have to make a change, but the change is not without ramification. It's hard for people to
That's right.
gravitate towards. It can cause a spike in funds. It can also cause a drop. Different organizations have experienced different things. So we can't, with any degree of integrity, turn around to someone and say, do this and your funding will be fine and it'll just go up. We don't know. There's been variance, and we know some tips of how to do it to minimize and mitigate some of those
Yeah.
dynamics and try to keep them in
Yeah.
control. But with all of that in mind, if you were sitting in front of an organization who currently has residential care and child sponsorship instead of me, what would you say to them? How would you encourage them? What would you recommend to them, drawing on your learning of what you did really well, what you wished you had do when you wished you had done some of those things perhaps?
Yeah.
What is your recommendation to somebody else?
That's a great question. So look, when we started and we had an orphanage and we were running it from America, because that's just the truth of what we were doing, this was a whole lot easier. And the child sponsorship model made sense because, donors donated $25 a month, and the $25 a month covered these expenses, and it was the same expenses for every one of those 40 children. And so, you sort of can run it as a program. Everybody gets school tuition. Everybody gets to go to the hospital for medical treatment if they need medical treatment. Everybody gets the same thing to eat. All of that was so much easier. When you transition to family-based care, you need a more skilled level of engagement with the clients and more power on the ground than back here in the States to run things. And part of this has been a whole shift. Yes, we shifted from orphanage to family-based care. Yes, we shifted our child sponsorship model to this other thing. But our entire sort of development mindset has shifted at the same time. So that our partnership over 25 years with this organization on the ground in Sierra Leone now is very much local solutions, local leadership, local context. They're empowered to serve the clients that they deal with every day. I don't make those decisions; they make those decisions, and that's how it should be. It's a much more complicated and difficult and nuanced way to work, but it's much better. And I think we'll have much better outcomes for the people on the ground that we're supposedly trying to support and help, right? And part of that is there's a social work team on the ground now that instead of saying, okay, well, everybody gets a backpack, whether you need a backpack or not, because everybody gets, that as a part of the SAC program, the SAC program. Now I've got skilled social workers on the ground who can say, well, this family needs a much higher level, a much more expensive sort of package of interventions for right now. And this family just needs a little tuition support. And I don't have to worry about the donor saying, well, but my donation, is supposed to give them all those things or whatever, because it's going into a pool and now I have skilled people on the ground making appropriate social work decisions about interventions that families need to actually move them to independence. So I think if you want to do the kind of complex, important, and powerful development work that a family strengthening program, that family-based care is, then you have to make that I don't see how you do that and carry a child sponsorship model. I just don't think they go together. It's like a tug of war. And you can ignore that tug of war is happening, but it's going to happen. You have development working at cross purposes with where you want programs to go. And I believe, and I think my development department believes this too. He's a really good friend of mine, so I know that he does. I believe that programs have to drive. They have to be what's making the deciding. And the fundraising that we do for that is to make those programs work. So they can't work against the program piece.
Yeah,
it just doesn't make any sense.
I think I fully agree with you. And I think we have to grapple with it's like saying, well, an orphanage is better than nothing. The same could be said of child sponsorship. Well, child sponsorship is better than nothing because without money, we can't do the programs. And so we settle for these compromised, not quite best practice kind of approaches because we say, well, that is harder and this is better than nothing. And so I'm just going to stay here.
People say that to me all the time. Isn't this better than nothing? Isn't an orphanage better than kids on the street? And my reaction to that is, why are we settling for that? Why is the bar we're setting for ourselves the least we can do? I mean, for my kids, I want it to be the most I can do. Why are we not stretching? And I don't even think we're stretching all that far.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I think it's really important that we address that mindset and that we have to be collectively, we have to be willing to push through those areas of discomfort or change is uncomfortable. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. It is in our human nature to run away from those things. But in this case, I think we have to keep the implications for children and families at the forefront and say, if we're being a little bit blunt, to say if we've inserted ourselves into the story of another country, of another community, then we best do that to the best ability of a family, of a child. That insertion is not, we're not actually obligated to do that. So if we take that upon ourselves, and I'm not discouraging that, but we best be doing it with an attitude of, and I will do that with wisdom, with sensitivity, with excellence, with knowledge and insight, not with, well, it's better than nothing type of approach. And I know that might sound a little bit harsh, but I really think we need to be challenging ourselves to do that.
I completely agree. Dan Hope said to me a couple of years ago, these are people's lives, and they're not just people's lives. They're vulnerable people's lives. They're vulnerable children's lives, and you don't play with people's lives.
Correct.
That's not, and I don't think any of us in this space that genuinely are focused on what's best for kids. I think if we sit down with ourselves and face that that's what we're trying to do, then we know that we're obligated to do that with excellence and skill and research and best practice. And this, it was, and it has been, I want to be really candid, and radically honest about this. It has been a difficult journey internally for HCW, the back and forth between HCW and CRC. This transition has been a difficult, and I said to the team when we started, this is going to be as hard a transition as it was to transition the orphanage. Like, you just need to be prepared, because we have to face all of the things that we got wrong, and we have to fix them, and we have to deal with all the stakeholders that think they have, often have say that they don't have. And there's going to be this massive re-education that has to happen, and it's going to be hard and complicated, and we're going to lose people on the way. It's going to be painful, and we still have to do it because in the end, it's what's right. And we have to do what's right because we're about vulnerable kids and families.
That's right. Absolutely. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. The compass is set to what's just, what's right, what's good,
Yeah.
what's moral. And that isn't about us. That is about the most vulnerable person in the story, which is the child and the family. And what is
That's
right
right.
and just and good for them. So appreciate that radical honesty. Appreciate your willingness to say it's necessary, but it's hard. We're not doing this because
Hard.
there's a smooth highway where you can cruise at 100 miles an hour towards this destination. It's bumpy, it's
Yeah.
hard, it can be painful, but it is absolutely necessary because at the end of the day, these things are incompatible. And therefore, if you're going to really move towards a very strong programming country, then this funding piece needs to be addressed in tandem with that. So that's fantastic. You have given so much insight into this process. Before I conclude the interview, is there anything that we haven't discussed today you think is really important, particularly thinking about others who may be walking in your shoes in the very near future? Anything final that you'd like to say to them or provide in terms of advice? Because really the goal here is to give that insight and knowledge to people so that they can actually walk out these processes with a little bit more confidence than perhaps they came into the interview with.
Yeah. Well, two things. One, I would say that where we've gotten it right and where we've navigated through these really rocky places is where we have reached out and collaborated with others and asked for help. And there are organizations out there who have gone through this, who have developed their own, kind of not child sponsorship package, or who have, navigated through that. And I know that they, like HCW, would be more than happy to just share with you what that journey's been like for them. Anytime we get into those just difficult places in the work that we do, the first thing I do is look around myself and go, okay, what can I read and who can I talk to and who can I ask about this? So that's the first thing. The other thing I think that I would say, just maybe as a kind of encouragement. I'm a mom. My kids are all in their 20s, and so they're in this really kind of cool part of their life right now where I get to sort of see them heading off into their adulthood and all of that. Um, and I have a soft spot in my heart for the caregivers that are taking care of the kids that in our program, and I want them to have that moment where, like, I think in a child sponsorship model, part of why people get into that is they feel a little bit, they get a little cape, right? I feel a little bit like a hero because I'm helping a vulnerable child in another country and whatever. And I don't want to take that good feeling of I'm doing something good for someone else and that makes me feel good about myself. I think it's okay to feel that. But I love that we put the cape on the parents. I love that we're highlighting them and we're building their capacity and we're strengthening and empowering them so that they can be the heroes in their own children's lives. And I love that we get to be a part of that. And I want to encourage our advocates, our donors, to feel like they get to be a part of empowering, another set of parents like that. For me, that's a way of feeling connected to not just the child, but the caregiver. And that honors them and their dignity. And I think that feels to me more rewarding than I make a donation and a kid gets a backpack and school tuition covered.
Yeah,
Um, so I think that I just think it's just a better way to approach it, and
really.
it's going to have a much impact.
Absolutely. And it's a really good thing to keep in mind for sponsors themselves to keep that, put the cape on the parent. I love that. And I think too, I'm also a mum with teenage daughters. And I think all of us who've got children can resonate with the feeling of saying, when you're in a situation where you want to be able to do something that will benefit your child, will help your child, that your child needs, meet a need that your child has, there is nothing more agonizing than being a parent and not having the means to do that, not having the power, the resources, the opportunities to be able to do what needs to be done for your child. That is one of the worst feelings as a parent. And when you make this transfer towards a family strengthening program, you are making sure parents are not in that position. You are giving them access
Uh,
to what they need to be that advocate for their own child and not feel disempowered in their child's upbringing. And I think all of us can resonate, can understand that feeling and what it's like to have that feeling taken away. be empowered and thinking,
Yeah,
okay, I want that mum, I want that dad, I want that grandma, that auntie to feel like that. And I want to get behind them to be able to make that part of their reality is also a really important perspective and very powerful and very rewarding
yeah,
to be able to do that for somebody else.
it is. Yeah, yeah. I find it honestly much more rewarding than I
Yeah,
was a sponsor in our child sponsor program,
yeah.
sponsorship program, but I find this so much more rewarding.
Yeah, well, hopefully others will too as they start to make this journey and this word gets out and this new education, a new way of approaching it, it becomes more normalized, then there can be more and more of those experiences. But thank you once again for your time today. This has been really
Thank
invaluable,
you.
chatting with you, and I really think this is going to be a helpful resource for others who are grappling with this very complicated, as you said, issue. This is not simple, but it's really necessary. So appreciate all your wisdom and all that you have shared today.